Good morning, everyone. It's time to begin, and welcome to everyone. Today, just wanted to check in. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, looks good. Okay, good. So today we are gonna finish our discussion of Yates chapter 2, and we're gonna start talking about Piven and Cloward's book, Poor People's Movement, and we're gonna just start discussing chapter 1 from that book. So just a reminder, in case you missed it, Tuesday, I did upload a review guide for the first exam, and you can find it in the iLearn website for the course in the assignments folder. It's also in the course materials folder for weeks weeks 3 and 4. And just a reminder again, your first exam is due not at the end of this week, but the end of next week, Sunday of week 4. It's going to be through iLearn. And we will be reviewing for this exam next week, but even today we're going over items from that review guide. So I encourage you to print it out if you haven't already, and take a look at it. So Yates in chapter 2 discusses the long history of union busting in the United States and the repression that workers faced as they organized. Employers responded to workers organizing in different ways. One of those ways was just through violence. Sheer violence. Often this was done through the complicity of the state, whether it's the local police or sometimes the National Guard. But sometimes these were private militia, private police that were hired by the employers, by the companies. These are kind of like the employers' thugs, basically. And they would repress workers very, very violently, right? Through shooting them, threatening to shoot them, etc. The other major form of union busting that took place in the pre-1935 era was firing and blacklisting of pro-union workers. And certainly this still happens today, but you know, if it happens, it's against the law, and employers can face charges, unfair labor practice charges against them if they do that. Prior to 1935, this was just very commonplace, a common way of getting rid of pro-union activists. Just fire them, right? Or put them on a blacklist and never hire them, and share that blacklist with other employers in the area. A third common way prior to 1935, when workers won the right to collective bargaining and the right to form a union, was for employers to require workers to sign yellow dog contracts. And these yellow dog contracts were agreements that workers would make to never join a union. And they were required to sign these agreements as a requirement of the job. Union organizers also face fines and even imprisonment for trying to get workers to break these agreements, these yellow dog contracts that they were forced to sign. Finally, a very common way that employers repressed workers who were organizing was by getting a court injunction that would forbid workers from taking direct action. And in the 1920s alone, more than 1,000 of these court injunctions against workers' action were issued, right? So this was very, very commonplace prior to 1935, when finally workers were given the legal right to form a union and collectively bargain with their employer. So how did unions form and bargain in this era when they had no real legal right to do that? Well, one of the ways they did that, Yates tells us, is just by taking direct action, right? They could go on strike and then negotiate over their terms of their employment. Strikes were often enforced with pickets, right? So there would be a picket line formed in front of the workplace, in front of the company. And then people, if they supported that strike, would not cross the picket line. And the picket line often would be workers, carrying signs, with their demands, right? So they would go on strike, enforce that with a picket line, and then anybody who crossed the picket line would be, sort of a scab, considered a scab that was breaking the strike, and, reducing its power. And so there was heavy pressure to ask people to support that picket line and not cross it. There were also sympathy strikes by other workers in support of that strike. And finally, there were boycotts that people would have for a company trying to put increased pressure on that company to negotiate with the workers, right? So people would boycott the products from that company until they would negotiate with the workers, right? So those were the main ways that unions bargained over the working conditions or wages prior to 1935. So in this early period, unions coordinated their work. They often didn't just work by themselves and form a union at their workplace and negotiate. They often coordinated across companies, across industries. They formed national unions within industries such as mine work, for example. And this is the very first one was formed in 1890, right, with the United Mine Workers of America, right? There were also local central labor councils through which unions across industries and across employers would coordinate their work and support each other if they took action. And that coordination was happening not just locally, but also at the nationwide level. As I mentioned, on Tuesday, there were national federations of labor that were formed. And one of the major ones was the American Federation of Labor, which initially formed in 1886. It was called something else, but it eventually became the AFL, which we still have today. Today we have the AFL-CIO, which was a merger between the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So that very early National Labor Federation, and the most common one today, right, was formed in 1886. So what did that National Labor Federation do? It published national labor newspapers. It also arbitrated disputes among unions. Like sometimes unions would compete with one another to organize a particular workplace, for example. So if there were disputes over who rightfully was organizing a particular group of workers, right, the National Labor Federation would help to mediate that dispute and resolve it. Third, they lobbied for political reforms, for pro-worker policies. They also provided experts on labor affairs. So they hired people to do research about industries, about employers, about the issues affecting workers. And they used the resources from their members to do that. Finally, they also used the resources of the National Labor Federation, and these were dues paying unions then contributing to the National Labor Federation, and that National Labor Federation would use that money then to organize new workers who were not yet organized. So they might hire a staff to help organize the workers. as Yates tells us, there was huge debates going on, as early as the 19th century, and still today we see these debates going on in the labor movement, whether or not it's better to form their own political party, a labor party or a socialist party, for example, that's very pro-worker, or should unions and workers work within the existing political system and try to find pro-labor candidates and push for policies within the dominant political parties. So those were the two major political approaches, and there was huge debates about that, as I mentioned, and in the early 19th century and early 1900s, right? You had Eugene Debs, right, who was the leader of the Socialist Party at the time, right? But then there was other leaders such as Gompers, right, who are saying, let's work within these systems, try to figure out the politicians that might listen to us and push for the policies that would help us, right? And still today, right, we still see that debate going on in the labor movement. Yates points out that the US labor history is one of tremendous militancy, right? We do have a weak labor movement in the sense that a small proportion of workers belong to unions, but this isn't because there wasn't a lot of militancy or efforts to organize, right? Instead, we see a long history of worker rebellions that emerge, and they often emerge in big waves, right? And we're about to begin to talk a little bit more about the 1930s wave of worker rebellion, right? But this was not the only one that happened, right? As Yates tells us, one of the first worker revolts was in 1877. This was called the Great Uprising. And at the time, the economy was in a depression. It had been in depression since 1873, and railway companies, who were the largest employer at that time, kept cutting wages, right? So railroad workers went on strike. And there was a huge sort of rebellion and strike wave that happened. Workers organized a spontaneous strike in Martinsburg, West Virginia, for example. And President Rutherford Hayes sent in federal troops to stop the strike, right? Again, the employers often relied on the state to repress striking workers in this era. But workers were outraged by this. And then the strike spread north and west, and it became a national insurrection, the Great Uprising of 1877. The 1886 rebellion, right, was a rebellion that we talked about on Tuesday, the rebellion for the 8-hour workday, right, where there was a general strike in support of this, because at that time, right, workers were working for 10, 12, sometimes 16-hour days, right? So there was a call out and a strike in support of getting 8 hours to be the legal time that workers were expected to work in a day. And if they worked over that, they should be paid overtime, right? So that was 1886, and the birth of May Day, right? So that rebellion. Then in 1894, there was a great Homestead Steel Strike. Here, the strike was against replacing union labor with non-union workers, right? So there was a huge strike in the steel industry, right? And then again, there in 1896, there was a Pullman strike that happened. And in the Pullman strike, right, this was the strike led by Eugene V. Debs. The workers at a railroad car factory struck over repeated wage cuts, and they battled with employers, and workers were broken by federal troops and court injunctions. And Debs himself, the leader of the American Railway Union, who was fighting with these workers, was imprisoned for not respecting the court injunction. So those were some of the early worker rebellions happening in the late 19th century. Then in 1919, there was a massive strike wave that happened. And then in the 1930s, there was huge rebellions among workers, right? Many of whom were facing wage cuts. They were trying to form unions and negotiate over wages and working conditions. There was sit-down strikes, and this was spreading all across the nation. The last major worker rebellion in our history was 1945 to 1946, right after World War II. Again, another major strike wave in the nation. You know, and some people suggest that we're currently beginning to see the emergence of such a strike wave, right? And we might recall last year the teachers' strikes, right, that happened in the last few years, right? And these spread all across the nation, and a lot of other workers were going on strike too. You know, so maybe that we're beginning to see an emergence, right, of worker rebellions currently. But there is a big gap, right, between our current period and 1946, right? But let's look a little bit more closely at that 1930s labor rebellions, because that was a very, very important period in our labor history. And our guest speaker, Teresa Conroe, right, mentioned that the 1930s period in many ways sort of inspired the worker organizing that's happening in the warehouse workers today. So what was happening in the 1930s that was so impressive? Well, there was sit-down strikes, right? You might remember the sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, with those auto workers. That historic sit-down strike inspired workers in other industries, and there was a massive wave of sit-down strikes among workers. Unemployed workers were also agitating and pushing for relief in jobs. They wanted the government to create jobs, which eventually they got, right? Or relief. And this was the birth of our welfare system that we have today, right? It was in part because unemployed workers, right, were organizing. There was also that enormous demonstration, 1932 in Chicago, right, 100,000. And in Minneapolis, the truck drivers went on strike, an enormous strike that was citywide. And the truck drivers went around from neighborhood to neighborhood, driving around this mobile strike that erupted in Minneapolis in 1934. Also part of this labor rebellion was the San Francisco General Strike of 1934, right? And so I want to show you a brief film clip about this general strike. And I want you to consider, and we're going to have some breakout groups to discuss this. Why do you think this 1934 general strike that we're about to watch and learn more about was so successful? And I want you to consider whether or not it's an example of inclusive organizing or exclusive organizing, right? Inclusive organizing tends to be industry-wide, tends to include people regardless of race or gender, the skilled, the unskilled, whereas exclusive organizing tends to focus on the skilled workers, right, and exclude other groups outside, right? Those are the two organizing strategies. So as you watch this, I want you to think about that. And if this general strike was so successful, what do you think made it so successful? Why was this such an inspiration for workers around the country? So I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to now share my other screen. And this is a brief film clip from Golden Land's Working Hands.
The New Deal is also responding to the growing number of demonstrations and strikes by working people, often organized by left-wing groups. Some of these events, by their size and militancy, seem to... After 15 years of the open shop on the San Francisco waterfront, dock workers are sick of shape-ups, of bribing bosses to get work, and of making 75 cents an hour. When a group of rank-and-file longshoremen radical activists start up a newsletter agitating for change, they find a receptive audience. Section 7A of the National Recovery Act allows workers to join unions. Thousands of West Coast longshoremen stream into the International Longshoremen's Association, or ILA. They demand a union-run hiring hall, a 25-cent per hour raise, and a 30-hour week so that work could be shared equally. When the employers reject these ideas, 12,000 longshoremen strike the West Coast on May 9, 1934. The public is generally sympathetic. Many students come out to demonstrate their support. Sailors and other maritime workers join the strike. They want their own changes to deal with working 14 to 16-hour days, rotten food, and living quarters on ships Andy Furuseth describes as
bigger than a coffin, but smaller than a grave.
They also want an end to hiring through employer-run think halls. All the unions agree no one returns to work until everyone gets what they need. With 40,000 on strike, this is the largest maritime job action in U.S. history. An immigrant Australian longshoreman named Harry Bridges emerges from the ranks as head of the strike committee. Articulate, a brilliant strategist, Harry insists any settlement must be voted on by all members of the union. National ILA President Joe Ryan flies out from the East. Conservative and corrupt, Ryan feels more comfortable with the bosses than with these new militant West Coast unionists. He signs 2 agreements with employers. Neither contains any of the strikers' demands. Ryan attempts to explain at a meeting of thousands of San Francisco longshoremen. Unaccustomed to democratic unionism, he is startled when they overwhelmingly reject his settlements. Rank and file longshoreman Pirate Larson leaps on stage.
This guy's a fake, and he's trying to make fakes out of us. Let's throw him out.
As he leaves, Ryan warns.
Bridges does not want this strike settled. My firm belief is that he is acting for the communists.
The employers open the ports with a massive show of force. They are determined to crush the maritime workers' strike. The bosses hire 1,000 strikebreakers in San Francisco alone, including hundreds of black workers who are barred from the union. This tactic is neutralized when the union, breaking with its racist past, approaches African-American longshoremen and asks them to join the union and the strike. Many do. But on July 5th, other weapons are turned on the strikers. One witness reports,
struggling knots of longshoremen, closely pressed by officers mounted and on foot, swarmed everywhere. The air was filled with blinding gas, the howl of the sirens, the low boom of the gas guns, the crack of pistol fire, the whine of the bullets, the shouts and curses of sweating men. Everywhere was a rhythmical waving of arms, like trees in the wind, swinging clubs, swinging fists, hurling rocks, hurling bombs.
As the police moved from one group to the next, men lay bloody, unconscious, or in convulsions, in the gutters, on the sidewalks, in the streets.
Around on Madison Street, a plainclothesman dismounted from a radio car, waved his shotgun nervously at the shouting pickets who scattered. I saw nothing thrown at him. Suddenly, he fired up and down the street, and 2 men fell in a pool of gore, one evidently dead, the other half attempting to rise, but weakening fast.
Longshoreman Howard Sperry is dead. A block away, so is cook Nick Bordeaux, who was volunteering in the strike kitchen.
Not one smile in the endless blocks of marching men. Crowds on the sidewalk, for the most part, stood with heads erect and hats removed. Others watched the procession with fear and alarm. Here and there, well-dressed businessmen from Montgomery Street stood amazed and impressed, but with their hats still on their heads. Sharp voices shut out of the line of march.
Take off your hat.
The tone of voice was extraordinary. The reaction was immediate. With quick, nervous gestures, the businessmen obeyed. As the last marcher broke ranks, the certainty of a general strike, which up to this time had appeared to many to be a visionary dream of a small group of the most radical workers, became for the first time a practical and realizable objective.
Against the advice of San Francisco Labor Council officers Edward Vandeleur and Mike Casey, 64 unions vote to strike. Seeing the writing on the wall, even the conservative council officers vote for a general strike. And then strikers run the city. Workplaces are shut tight. With the exception of emergency deliveries allowed by the general strike leadership, virtually no work takes place.
Laboring men appeared on the streets in their Sunday clothes, shiny celluloid union buttons glistening on every lapel. Common social barriers were swept away in the spirit of the occasion. Strangers addressed each other warmly as friends.
Then it was the employer's turn to counterattack. City government and the media whip up public hysteria. An army of communists is marching on San Francisco. The strikers are going to starve the city into submission. In this atmosphere, hundreds are arrested. And so-called radical hangouts are wrecked in a massive effort to eliminate the imaginary alien red menace. After 4 days, Labor Council conservatives, over the angry objections of the maritime unions, call off the general strike.
To you, Mr. Vandeleur, as president of the San Francisco Labor Council and chairman of the General Strike Committee, and to your associates, I offer my congratulations upon your decision and the part it has played in bringing to an end the general strike in San Francisco.
The inconclusive use of their biggest weapon convinces most longshoremen and many seamen that time has come to compromise. Longshoremen vote to submit all issues to federal arbitration and to end the strike. The sailors are unhappy, but know they now have no choice but to wait for arbitration too. But before going back, old Andrew Furuseth has the last word. He has his members build a bonfire to burn their think books. At work, the bosses awaken to a different world. Workers refuse to labor alongside strikebreakers. Unsafe working conditions and speed up are rejected. The workers enforce their own new rules with direct action. When problems arise, they vote and strike quickly on dock after dock and ship after ship. Shape Up and Think Hall are gone, replaced by union-run hiring halls. Workers govern their organizations through rank-and-file union democracy. Sailors Union leader Harry Lundeberg and longshoreman Harry Bridges bring together a powerful federation of maritime unions. The owners are furious, but maritime workers have learned how to take care of themselves. The fear is gone. Industrial unionism is established on the West Coast, and it's radical.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I'm gonna put you all into breakout groups, and I'm gonna ask you to sort of reflect on what you just watched and think about sort of what made that particular strike so successful in 1934. And, you know, in what ways did it embody inclusive or exclusive organizing models? All right, so I'm gonna put you all into a breakout group. And we'll come back and discuss it as a group. So see you soon. Have a good discussion.
Very tired.
Oh, are you not sleeping well, or?
I never sleep well. I have really bad insomnia.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That's rough. Yeah. No, it's nice to see you. Yeah. And how's it going with your grad classes and everything?
They're pretty dull.
Oh. Yeah, the first year is hard, huh? Yeah. And I paused the recording, by the way, so hopefully we're not. I don't know. We might be live on YouTube though. Or whoever might be watching my strange obscure channel. Right. Well, it's nice to see you. Anyway, we'll probably come back in a few minutes. And it's nice that Dean Pena is teaching that qual methods class. That's so cool. And are you still working on that project we talked about?
Yep.
That's great. That's awesome.
I still haven't gotten a definitive answer from that professor at Sac State.
Oh, you reached out to her. Yeah, cool. But yeah, nice. And nice that you found somebody that does that kind of work. And maybe, you know, if nothing else, just read her work or, you know, learn what you can from her that way. Yeah, I'm sure she's pretty busy trying to learn online teaching, much as I am. Yeah. Yeah, we'll just give everybody a few minutes more. And yeah, and I think, you know, I think also we could still consider like Tanya or Shun maybe too as like a co-chair. I know you've been working with Shun.
They don't want to do that. They don't know enough about it to be valid.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah. And I wonder, I think Bruce uses stigma theory a lot. So my other thought is maybe he's pretty familiar with Goffman or something. So I don't know. That might be another thought to consider. I don't know if you've had classes with Bruce Slink yet, or.
He's teaching Quant 2.
Oh, got it. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Which might not give you a sense of his substantive research, but maybe he's working it in. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. That's another thought. But yeah, I'd say just dive into it. And it sounds like Shun and Tanya are willing to serve on the committee, though. So that's great. So maybe we just do what we can, right? Yeah. And figure it out. And
There's also Randall Contreras.
oh,
who
that's
used to be in the
great.
department.
Yeah,
He does
absolutely.
ethnography
He's an
work.
ethnographer. Yeah, no, he's a good, yeah, that's an excellent idea. Yeah, because he's sort of used these methods himself. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a thought. Yeah. I don't know if you've met him yet.
I
And
haven't.
maybe, yeah, maybe you could reach out and see if you could find out when his office hours are, because that's what it's for, is just to kind of meet with students, and maybe that would be a good time to reach out to him.
Yeah.
I did see him on Tuesday, yeah, around Alessandra's practice job talk thing. So yeah, so he's around, and yeah, an excellent resource. So yeah.
Of course, I had to pick something no one knows anything about.
Well, yeah, keeps it innovative, but you know a lot about it, and I think well, maybe there's some important contributions. So I'm gonna close our rooms, and we're gonna get other students joining us, and if in like a minute left, but it's nice to catch up with you. I'm gonna stop the recording pause so we can resume the recording. There we go. It looks like we're beginning to get folks back, and the other breakout groups should be closing out in the next 30 seconds or so. Welcome everybody who's coming back, and we could just begin to hear some of the discussions that you had. If anybody would like to start, we'll continue to get more students back in. Anybody want to start?
I think it was pretty obvious that they were being very inclusive because they had immigrants. Eventually, they added Black workers. It also seemed like they were very organized and adhering to like this idea of solidarity, because they were always including other labor unions. It was multiple unions working together, creating like elections for general strikes and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's inclusive, right, across race, right, around immigrant status, right, and then you're mentioning also across industries, right, because other workers were supporting them, right, especially as striking workers met with such high level repression, right, and people getting killed, right, right, and there was a lot of solidarity. So yeah, is this Gabriel that was talking or somebody else?
Yeah, Gabriel.
Gabriel, yeah. Yeah, so there's a high level of solidarity. It seemed like people were very organized. Anybody else have more to add to that discussion about maybe what contributed to the success of this strike?
Yeah, so I agree entirely with what Gabriel's saying. Like, the strategies and the tactics that the strikers used of, bringing everybody in, across lines of racial division and across different industries were so important to the success of the strike. And what we talked about a little bit in our group was just the importance of the kind of radical leadership to the strike to kind of bring that strategy into play, because it's like the mainstream press was trying to paint it as kind of just all reds and things like that, which was just kind of true, because Harry Bridges and a lot of these people were communists and had a kind of broader working class perspective that they were able to bring to the strike, and organize across all of those lines of division and make it a really democratic strike, which gave it a lot of power because it had huge buy-in from all of the workers.
Yeah, so I think you're bringing up issues of leadership too, and I guess that gets back to Fletcher and Gapasine's point that who's leading these unions mattered, right? And Matt's also bringing up the whole issue that it was very democratic, right? And yeah, and Harry Bridges was like the leftist leaders that Fletcher and Gapasine were describing, you know, only in a different era, right, in the 1930s rather than the 19th century. But yeah, they very much believed in democracy, right? And so the strike, you know, they had to, the workers had to agree, right, when it was over, right? And there was that effort of that sort of corrupt union boss trying to come in and say it's over before the workers were ready, right? But yeah, but they made sure that people voted on things, and that, you know, the rank and file had a say, right? So yeah, so leadership, organization, solidarity. Any other thoughts on this about what made it a successful strike? Or any other things that you were struck with as you watched this video? Well, I think that, yeah, I think people hit on the big important points there. I think maybe one other issue is the fact that, you know, they didn't stop when 2 people got killed, and in fact they used that funeral, right, to galvanize more support, right? And so they turned that around. That moment that it could have been that, you know, people got killed, and then people, you know, could have gotten scared and stopped agitating, but instead they turned it around, and those workers getting killed, they commemorated it, they made it very public, right, and they galvanized even more support.
Professor,
Yes.
I just wanted to know if in the beginning I felt like it was exclusive and then it went into inclusive.
Oh, yeah, that's a very good point. Is this Adrian?
Yes.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, there was a shift, right, that was happening, right? And yeah, the beginning of this strike, yeah, Blacks were excluded, right? So you went from a more exclusive kind of union to a more racially inclusive one, right? So there was a shift in the politics of that union, and that was happening not just in the longshoremen's union, but in many unions across the country, right? And this whole issue about breaking the color line, right, and forging solidarity across race, across gender, right? So yeah, so that's a very important point, right? That, and that the politics, it was dynamic, it was shifting, right, and in response to the moment, right? And I think workers realized that, you know, if they were racially exclusive, then it could just be that, you know, then employers would hire workers of color as scabs and break their strike, right? But if instead they worked together and forged solidarity with them, the employers couldn't use that strategy, right? They couldn't use strike breakers and racism, right, to divide the workers, right? And the workers themselves, right, and workers of color, right, they, you know, made very strategic decisions to join hands, right, and to work together. So yeah, that's a very good important point, Adrian. All right, so I'm not gonna share my screen again, and I want to turn back to lecture. And I think we had a really great discussion. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that. And I just wanted to then think about a little bit about the significance of this 1930s period, of this tremendous worker rebellion, and why it was so important. And I'm just muting everybody so you can hear me a little better. So this period was one of substantial worker rebellion, sit-down strikes happening, right? These general strikes, citywide strikes, right? In Minneapolis, San Francisco, right? And in response, you had the New Deal government led by President Roosevelt, right? And passing a series of labor laws, right? And just to remind you, right, we had the Norris LaGuardia Act that kind of restricted the use of court injunctions against striking workers in 1932. Then in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was passed, Section 7 of which gave most workers the right to collective bargaining. And there were some workers left out, as we mentioned before, but most workers gained the right to collective bargaining in 1935 through that act. And then in 1938, the Congress and President signed into legislation the Fair Labor Standards Act. And as we mentioned, that was a historic act because it finally gave workers the 8-hour workday. Right? They had been working for so long, right, since the 1890s, right, in the birth of May Day, around that struggle. It's not until 1938 that they won that right, and it was put into legislation. And if workers work over those 8 hours, they're supposed to be getting overtime pay time and a half, right? That Fair Labor Standards Act was also very historic because it also prohibited child labor, right? And this was another long-standing policy campaign that for many years, workers and their supporters were campaigning for, to get rid of the practice of employing small children in factories and fields and other kinds of work, right? And I want to really just take a moment to reflect on the importance of that, right? And how long-standing that campaign had been. So I want to show you this brief clip about Lewis Hine, who took a stand against child labor, was part of the forces that have been really pushing for a prohibition against child labor. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm going to show you yet another brief film clip, and then we'll break into breakout groups to reflect on this film. And I want you to actually, I think, let me give you the questions just so you can sort of think about it. So the questions I want you to think about as you watch this next film is, what roles can artists and writers play in supporting the struggle for workers' rights? And as we mentioned, the labor movement is not just workers, right? It can involve other groups who support workers, right? So we're going to think about Lewis Hine, the role he played, and then think more broadly about artists and writers and how can they support the struggle for workers' rights. And I want you to think, not just about the past, but think about today. Like if child labor was the issue way back when, that this issue, this huge problem facing workers, what is that problem today? What are some of the still remaining issues, the rights that workers should have but don't yet have? What do you think are the policies we need today? And would art and policy advocacy be enough to win those new rights that you might want to see? Why or why not, right? So thinking about both the roles that artists and writers can play, but maybe also the limits, right, of what they can and can't do for the labor struggle. So that's a long setup. I'm going to now turn to the film clip. I'm going to stop sharing that screen. I'm going to pull up the film clip and we're going to watch it for just 9 minutes, and then you're going to have another breakout group.
At the beginning of the 20th century, child labor was rampant in the United States. Some children worked 19-hour days with 1 hour of break. These children also experienced extremely poor working conditions, were exposed to dangerous machinery, and received cruel punishments for minor mistakes. Although laws were passed in the late 19th century to protect working children and outlaw child labor, these laws were disregarded and unenforced in many American factories. In response to these abuses, crusaders arose to fight on behalf of children exploited by these circumstances. One such hero was Lewis Hine. Lewis Wicks Hine was born on September 26, 1874, in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, to Douglas Hull and Sarah Hine. Hine's father died when he was 18. Lewis worked in various jobs, including a clothing store, water filter company, and bank, to support his family before starting college at the University of Chicago in 1900. He moved to New York in 1901 to attend New York University while teaching at the Ethical Culture School. Lewis Hine discovered an interest in photography while working at the Ethical Culture School, photographing school events and using the camera as a teaching tool. He married in 1904, and in that same year began his first series of documentary photographs. This series was about immigrants moving through Ellis Island. Frank Manny, Hine's friend and colleague, supported him and told him to portray the newly arrived with the same dignity and respect as those immigrants who landed at Plymouth Rock. Hine graduated from New York University in 1905 and continued to work at the Ethical Culture School. In 1906, he began doing freelance photography work for the National Child Labor Committee. The National Child Labor Committee was founded in 1904 with the aim of promoting the rights, awareness, dignity, well-being, and education of children and youth as they relate to work and working. Lewis Hine's self-stated aim was similar, to show the things that had to be corrected in the nation's workforce and factories. It is no surprise that the committee hired him full-time in 1908. Lewis Hine's new job was as the official photographer of the NCLC. He would keep this job for about a decade while working on a degree from Columbia University in sociology. This was the first time Hine had received a monthly salary for photography, and he was determined to use photography to change the nation for the better. He traveled throughout the country, photographing child laborers in canneries, factories, mines, textile mills, agricultural industries, and street trade. He traveled 12,000 miles in 1 year on his crusade. Hine was clearly shaken by some of his visits to such mills as the Bibb Mill in Macon, Georgia. As he said in the caption of one of his photos, some boys and girls were so small they had to climb up onto the spinning frame to mend broken threads and put back the empty bobbins. During his travels throughout America, Hine discovered many children far too young to work who, as he quoted in a caption, had just happened in or were helping sister. This was a common lie told by children who needed to work to survive, although, even under the abusive standards of the time, they were too young. Lewis Hine also photographed young newsies, or children selling newspapers on the street. Many of these children came from Washington, D.C. Hine's caption for this photograph of a young child selling newspapers on the street was, "Michael McNeilis, age 8, a newsboy. This boy has just recovered from his second attack of pneumonia, was found selling papers in a big rainstorm." Hine traveled along the Mississippi River and the East Coast, photographing young seafood workers. This picture shows a typical canning factory. The oyster shuckers worked from 3:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. This little girl works in the factory as well, helping her mother. This young boy, age 5, is in his second year of work. He does not understand English. Children were given knives to chop sardines, but the fish and utensils were slippery, so accidents were frequent. As one young boy said, "The salt water gets into the cuts and they ache." The children had to suffer these injuries without any medical aid. Sometimes Hine had to sneak into factories because the managers didn't want their crimes against children to be discovered or published. He adopted many disguises, including those of a tramp, a peddler, a Bible salesman, and a postcard vendor. Once he was inside these closed factories, Hine secretly took photographs of children and jotted down their names and vital statistics in a small, hidden notebook. He knew the distance from each of the buttons on his vest to the floor and used this to measure the height of young children for his research. Hine sometimes pretended to be an industrial photographer and asked children to step into the photos he took of machines, telling the factory managers that the children were there to give it a sense of scale. Sometimes Hine was unable to gain entrance to certain factories. If he couldn't get in, he would talk to the children at their homes in the early morning before their workday began. Hine worked for the NCLC until 1917, when he took a job with the Red Cross and went to Europe to take documentary photographs. Others continued his work at the National Child Labor Committee, although none quite so famous. Throughout the next 20 years, Hine continued his sociological photography, as he liked to call it. In 1924, Congress attempted to amend the Constitution to outlaw child labor, but the bill did not pass and had to be dropped. Ironically, it took a depression to end child labor for good, the Great Depression. When America's economy dropped to rock bottom, adults with families to feed and no money were forced to take jobs for the lower wages paid to children. These adults soon outnumbered the children in the work market, and child labor was finished. Hine's work came to final fruition in 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's tenure. The Fair Labor Standards Act states that 16 years is the minimum age for children to begin working in any occupation other than agriculture. The passage of this law was a triumph for Hine and his former employers, the National Child Labor Committee.
All right, so we'll stop right there. So I'm gonna now put you in your breakout groups, and I want you to just reflect on these questions. And I'll give you about 5 minutes or so. Sorry. Yeah, so the questions again is just thinking about, thinking about Lewis Hines, and if you were to sort of try to document, what are the things that had to be corrected today? What would they be? What would those things that have to be corrected today that might be documented by artists or writers or policy advocates, and maybe what are the limits and strengths, right, that they can bring in that fight in supporting workers' rights. So I'm going to break you into breakout groups, and we'll come back and discuss that. Hey, Elena, how are you?
Great.
You're great. I think we just have about a minute left or so. I'm gonna start pulling them back. What do you think? I was kind of, I for some reason I didn't realize he was a sociologist until I watched that again. That was interesting. All right, maybe an early visual sociologist, right? Um, I'm gonna close out our rooms. Yeah. Hey everybody, welcome back. And I'm curious what you came up with. And yeah, I kind of asked you to reflect on, what are the things today that you think should be corrected? That's sort of what Lewis Hine wanted to do, right? In the early 1900s, he saw, children working at such young ages and dangerous occupations, and wanted to put a stop to that. What would you want to put a stop to today? What are sort of the issues remaining, the rights that workers don't yet have that might need maybe more attention, maybe need to be documented or photographed or sung about or talked about? What did you come up with?
I think in today's age, YouTube content creators, I think serve a good role in like sort of discussing and spreading information or issues that deal with like different policies or problems like labor.
Yeah, today, like, we've got YouTube. We can just upload videos, right? People can interview workers maybe. And yeah, what might be some of the YouTube videos that you're seeing or other people are making, or yeah.
Like different progressive content creators, like Secular Talk, like political ones,
Yeah. And so what kind of rights, do workers not yet have, that, maybe needs more attention or more people being aware of it,
Stuff like paid sick leave and stuff.
Sick leave, right? Very important, right? Yeah. And maybe more attention to maybe the people that don't have paid sick leave, especially at this time, right? Yeah, maybe what impacts that has, right? You can imagine, maybe interviewing, workers, right? Wishing they had paid sick leave, right? Maybe interviewing their family members, right? And so forth. Yeah. And then putting it up on YouTube or something like that. Yeah. So yeah, paid sick leave. Any other issues people came up with? Yeah, I think that's a one that's definitely, on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And I think the other question I asked was, what's the role that artists and advocates for new policies can play, and maybe also what are some of the limits, to what they can do to push for policies? Because we learned from that film clip, Lewis Hine, worked with that labor committee right from all the way from like 1905, right? And it wasn't until 1938, right, that we got the Fair Labor Standards Act, which prohibited child labor, right? So just, having great photographs and things like that, right? It didn't really lead to a policy change overnight. So yeah, what do you think about that? What roles can artists and policy advocates play, and are they enough? What do you think?
We discussed in my group about how they do elicit like strong emotional responses, but it's not enough, and it's kind of an exploitation of the workers even more sometimes, or or the people who are being photographed that are in these bad conditions. It's kind of an exploitation of them to like take photos of them when they're being vulnerable and
right, yeah. So yeah,
those.
yeah, you were sort of questioning, well, you know, maybe they didn't really have real consent from, right? Especially
Right.
if you told these young workers that, you know, I'm just trying to get a sense of scale or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think they would be good at like highlighting the problems, but I think in terms of proposing policy changes and stuff like that, that would be a point where they may not be as skilled in doing, I think.
And yeah, and so why and then that's Gabriel talking?
Yeah.
Yeah, so and why might they not be able to come up with all the solutions, or who should, or yeah.
Well,
oh, you could talk.
And maybe not just for Gabriel. Let's throw it out to the other students too.
yeah. So we were talking in our group about like how important it is for artists and the, you know, writers to amplify these kind of struggles. But I mean, if you look at the timing of when the Fair Labor Standards Act was won, and then, you know, Social Security and unemployment insurance and the Wagner Act and all these things, like just immediately preceding that, I mean, is everything that we talked about in class today, all of this militant upsurge of labor struggle at the point of production that really just kind of scared the crap out of you know, all of the politicians and policymakers in Washington. So they felt they had to do something or risk like it spiraling even more out of their control. So like it's important to amplify, but like if you want to actually win things, you got to have that mass action going on.
Yeah. So, and I think that's a really important point that that Piven and Cloward are making, right? In their book Poor People's Movement. So now I want to sort of turn to that, you know, with that thought in mind, because I think that is precisely the point that Piven and Cloward are making. So I'm gonna mute everybody just so you can hear me better, and but we're gonna have hopefully time for another breakout group, but we might just get started because I'm realizing we just have 10 minutes left. I'm gonna mute you all just for a moment. All right, so Poor People's Movement, this first chapter lays out their sort of theory about poor people's movements and when they rise and when they can succeed. And Piven and Cloward argue that there are two main sources of social power in our society. One is control over the means of physical coercion, right, which the state has a monopoly on. And the other is a control over the means of producing wealth, which is the main source of power among capital, right, or employers. And they argue that control over one source is often used to gain control over the other source, right? So if you have a lot of wealth, right, often you can then elect politicians who will do your bidding, right, and can coerce and repress, right, workers. And we just saw good examples of that in the 1934 general strike. They argue that these two main sources of social power leads to a tendency towards one ruling class, where the state and capital are often working hand in hand to control society. They suggest that they sometimes use repression, but more generally, state and capital often control people's beliefs and culture, as well as their action, right? The beliefs and culture, some scholars call this the superstructure, right? It's just kind of our ideologies, our beliefs, our values, and so on. And then they also suggest state and capital also do control people's actions, right? Just you know, by paying people to show up to work and do certain kinds of work and not other kinds of work, right? They control their actions. They suggest that the dominant beliefs in our society often tend to legitimize those in power and the status quo, right? And in modern societies, they argue that the existence of this ruling class is very obscure. It's often not talked about, and Instead, the existence of powerful groups in society are often legitimated and upheld, right? We have that sort of myth of meritocracy, that if you are wealthy, right, that you deserve it, right? You got that wealth through your own merits rather than inheriting that wealth, right? Or getting it through exploiting workers and so forth, right? So those kinds of myths, the myth of meritocracy, the American dream, right? That all you have to do is work hard and then you'll succeed, right? Those kinds of ideologies often obscure the power of the ruling class, right? And class struggles often don't seem possible or right, right? People often don't think it's possible for things to be otherwise. In this chapter, Piven and Cloward are rejecting a pluralist model of politics. And that pluralist model suggests that electoral representative procedures disperse power in our society, right? That there is sort of a balance of power, and we just simply have to vote for the candidates we like and ask for policies we need, and we'll get them, right? That power is dispersed. There isn't one or two groups that really monopolize the power, right? They're rejecting that argument. Instead, they argue, right, that the power of wealth and force restricts democratic participation and often shapes political influence, including our electoral system, such that electoral choices are often determined by those with power and wealth, right? They often have the wealth to back candidates, the candidates that might promote their interests. They also suggest, though, that this doesn't mean that poor people have no power, right? Instead, they suggest that they do have power and that their main source of power is in protest, right? Protest and disruptive protests in particular is the way in which poor people can get heard in our society. So I want you just to reflect. We just have a few minutes left. So I'm gonna leave into a breakout group, and if you have to leave at 12:20, that's okay, but I do want you to just have a few minutes to reflect on that, because there's a lot to take in, and whether or not you agree with Piven and Cloward's analysis of US politics and protests, and that protest, not voting, is poor people's main source of power, and why or why not. So I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. I'm going to break you into breakout groups and give you just a few minutes to reflect on that, and then class will end after that. Hi there. Hi, Celeste and Alan and Selma.
Hi.
Lauren. Oh yeah, so I didn't give you much time. We only have about a minute left. I'm gonna unpause the recording before I forget. And so yeah, so curious what came up in your discussions. Any thoughts on this? Do you agree with Piven and Cloward's analysis? Disagree with it? Is it overly simplistic, or do you buy it? Do you agree with it? What do you think?
I agree with it to an extent, maybe overly simplistic in the sense that local government isn't as corrupt as like federal. But I do think that not many politicians represent interests of poor people, and we just do that time and time again. But yeah. That's what I think.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe they're talking at the national level. Maybe we can't just elect politicians, but maybe there's more room for that at the local level, right? Yeah. So maybe you're thinking, yeah. So maybe there's a little bit of oversimplification there. Any other thoughts? I know we're at 12:20. Probably you had some really great discussions, but we will continue to talk about this book next week. So I hope you had some good thoughts and good discussions, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I do have office hours now if anybody wants to stick around and continue the conversation, or have any questions or concerns, or want to talk about the exam coming up or whatever it is that's on your mind. I'll be here until 12:50, but if you got to go, I totally get it. It's busy and you've got a lot going on in your lives too. So.
Hello, Dr. Griggs.
Yes.
I just want to know on the test, how much time are we going to have on that test?
Oh, is this Adam?
Yes.
Adam, yeah, I'm still actually making the test, so I'll probably have more of an idea by Tuesday. I haven't finished it yet. Yeah, so I'll try to give that some thought. I mean, it won't take more than an hour or so. Yeah, but yeah, and if anybody needs an accommodation, that's fine. I can make exceptions if I get something from the Office for Student with Disabilities, but yeah, and usually my tests, I people finish them pretty quickly. They're fairly standard and so forth. So yeah.
And then are we going to we're taking the same day of class, and is that going to be at the same time as class, or is that going to be like throughout the day?
After, yeah, because I want to be able to review. So yeah, so it's gonna be after class, and then it's just due on Sunday night. So anytime between after class and Sunday. And as I said, I don't think it's gonna take more than an hour of your time.
Okay.
So you just, at your convenience, you can take it. And I would even encourage people to take it right after class if they can. I mean, if they have another class right after, obviously you can't, but it might be fresh in your head because we've just been reviewing some of it, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So if you can, that's the best time to do it. But, you have all the way through Sunday night. And I realize, people have a lot going on, especially at this time. And, so, if it's works better to do it another time, or people need to study a little more, you have it all the way till Sunday, right before midnight to finish it up.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Any other questions or comments, or yeah, what's on people's minds? Looks like Felisa and Robert and Noah. It's good to see you.
Hey. Yeah, I really enjoyed this lecture.
Oh, thanks.
There was something nostalgic about hearing about the strength of the old unions.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of good discussions when we broke up into our groups.
Oh, was it? Oh, good. Yeah. I feel like I'm missing a lot of good discussions, but maybe they're even better because I'm not there. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, cool. What came up for you? Yeah.
For the middle discussion. Oh, did you have a thing or?
Oh, no, no. I think it was just an alarm to remind myself because I kept always going over.
Oh, for sure.
So I like set, I realized I need to set an alarm to like be like, it's class is over, right?
For
That
sure.
was just my,
Totally.
yeah.
I have
but-
like 9 different alarms going right now because
Yeah.
like of the different classes, but also like my mom has meds that she needs to take at certain times.
Oh,
I'm like,
yeah.
wait, which one is this? You know?
Oh my gosh.
Um,
Okay, yeah. So
yeah,
you're helping her out then? Yeah.
yeah. She just had a surgery, so it's like
Oh,
various
wow.
Tylenols and things.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Okay.
where was my brain? Oh, so for the middle one, kind of worker rights that aren't fully implemented yet. My group members, they raised their good topic of like immigrant rights and things like that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Um, and then a big one for me that I didn't bring this up in the group because they had a lot to say and I wanted to kind of hear that, but um, things just like right to work or just living wage and some of these really baseline ones were the first that came into my head. You know, like
Uh-huh.
obviously we should push
Like
everything at
if you want to
once.
work and not finding a job and there's not enough jobs for everybody, is that what you're saying? Yeah. And
Yeah,
especially full-time jobs or jobs that pay well, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Jobs. Yeah.
The for me, like the core right of just having a job that does the purpose of having a job is
Yeah.
like
No,
two
exactly.
important things.
Yeah, yeah. In the 1930s, right, they created that Works Progress Administration, right? Because not enough uh, people, there weren't enough jobs for people, right? It was like
Yeah,
a third of the workforce was working, but like, or a third of them were out of work, right? 1 out of 3 people had no job, right? And
yeah,
yeah, and so yeah, and I think especially at this time, people are getting very nervous, especially, what's going to happen with the economy? Is it going to crash? People that are, already being told, you can't work now, go on unemployment, stay at home, stay safe, but then they're like, well, when am I going back to work, right? And how long is unemployment going to last, right? And yeah, no, I think this is a big issue. I think we're about to head into a major recession or possibly a depression, right? Much like the 1930s, right?
yeah. It's crisis,
Yeah.
and I've seen a lot of people describe this as sort of like the beginning of the end of the American Empire. But I don't know. Maybe that's
Yeah.
extreme, but
No, yeah, it could be. Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, we'll have to see where it's head. I think, a lot of people are very concerned and worried and precisely about that, like about work, like for some of us, like myself, I feel like privileged, right, to be able to stay home and continue working, but not everybody can do that, right? Construction workers can't, a lot of the restaurants, right,
yeah.
right, folks, yeah. Yeah.
And some people like their job still may exist, but it's hard to go in because of like immunology or epidemiological reasons, like,
Yeah,
or
it's
they're
not
still
safe.
going in
It's
despite
not
that.
safe. Yeah. So it's like
Yeah,
either you're unemployed or you're not safe. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, it's not,
My
yeah,
friend
yeah.
Sam is heavily immunocompromised, and he had a recent scare. We thought for a second that he might have it, and it would be a death sentence. It would just,
Oh,
but he's still working because he has to.
wow.
Um,
Oh my
like,
gosh. That's so hard.
yeah, it's
Uh,
scary.
it is
Uh,
very scary. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. And so I think that is maybe like something that needs like more exposure, right? And, especially, some of us like myself that can stay home and work, we are not facing that, right? That day-to-day struggle and fear, right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And it's
yeah,
scary, right? It's
and
yeah.
it's hard to get mass action until enough people are feeling that fear. As long
Yeah.
as sort of.
Or what would the mass action look like too to stay safe? I think I don't know.
Oh, I mean, I don't mean like mass action right now. I just mean like it's hard to get mass action overall until enough people.
Yeah. And why do you think that is?
Well, when people are like feeling satiated, when people are comfortable, even if there's a lot of ambient discomforts, then they're kind of resigned,
Mhm.
Um,
So you feel like they're kind of bought off in a way, or like it's yeah,
well,
until they
like
get
I
to
wasn't,
the
I
bottom.
wasn't super alive in the 90s.
Uh-huh.
That's a strange way to say. I was born in 97, right? So I wasn't like
Okay.
a human
Yeah.
being. But,
Uh-huh. You were
but
young. Yeah.
yeah, I always feel I've heard that it was kind of for a lot of people, for sort of the middle class and even upper, like lower class, it was kind of a time of like inertia, or like not much was happening. People were kind of satiated, and a lot of people were saying things like, there was the famous book The End of History. Like, people were suggesting that all worldly problems were going to be solved by capitalist neoliberalism, and it was just a matter of time. And then we had things like 9/11.
Yeah.
But I can't say for myself whether I know that vibe is true of the 90s, because like I said, I wasn't super.
Like what was, well, no, I think you're right. There was a lot of complacency, right? And I mean, there were movements in the 90s for sure. Yeah. I mean, there was a whole sort of anti-apartheid movement that was happening, right? In solidarity of, South African Blacks in South Africa, right? And sort of ending the color line and the segregation, and and having the political rights, right? And so yeah. And then there was also movements like to uh, end like military spending in Central America, which was happening, and repressing movements down there. So there was a lot of international solidarity movements, and I think also maybe campaigns for living wages. I think was also fought out in the 1990s, a little like not every city, but I think major cities, that was happening. Various labor struggles, some of which we're actually going to talk about later this quarter, like the Justice for Janitors campaign was happening. So, but definitely, I think the mass movements, right, of the 1930s, right, was not happening, and yeah. And probably it is a very different era, and probably your generation, I imagine, is like a different generation. Yeah. And I think this COVID crisis is probably going to shape people's consciousness. It's hard to forget it, right? Yeah. How do you think it might shape people's consciousness?
How do I think it will shape people's consciousness? Of what age? Of what age group?
Maybe your own. Yeah.
I think a lot of, or I hope maybe, that a lot of people will be disillusioned with the status quo, right? I've seen a lot of posts that echo a really cool sentiment, that it's like, now whenever like a higher up or like a governmental entity or something tries to say that we can't do universal healthcare, they're lying. We know they're lying, right? We don't have to beat around the bush around it anymore. Anytime that an employer says you need to come in for this thing, it can't be done online, can't be done like digitally, they're lying. Et cetera, et cetera.
There's a lot of questioning of the status quo, right? Yeah. And Piven and Cloward suggests, right, that often happens when there's major disruptions, right? And this is a major disruption, right? Which kind of goes along with their argument. Yeah. So you feel like that's happening already, or you see it happening? Yeah.
Hopefully it catches on. I mean, we had things like we have economic crises within my lifetime, and we have like the Iraq War within my lifetime.
Remember that, like as a child, like the foreclosure crisis and the big.
I remember more like the 2008 one.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, which was a major recession, right? And people are losing their homes or jobs, right? Yeah.
But it seems like things like that, or things like mass like school shootings or all this stuff. Those things we're not really learning too much from, or like the Iraq War. Like, we are able to come out of these horrifying like cullings, bloodlettings, without learning much. So maybe COVID will be the same, and we won't make much progress, which is the scary side to it, I suppose.
Yeah. So you feel like it's like a brief opening, but then it might just go back to normal.
I don't know. Like, it's just so chaotic right now. And I'm like a 22. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think at this moment too, it's a very strange moment, because I think you're right. A lot of people are questioning things, thinking we need more protections, right? We need, jobs that people can do at home where they're safe right now. They need to have paid sick leave. They shouldn't have to face, endangering themselves and risking their lives, or not having enough rent to pay, like those are just not choices that people should have to face, right? And people, I think, are questioning things, right? But then at the same time, like, what do you do with that, right? Especially at this moment, you know. And I think, like, I do know some activists that are like doing like drive-through kind of protests, you know, with staying in your car and going
Yeah.
around and getting some media attention, or maybe, you know, somebody was bringing up YouTube, you know, it's probably there's a bunch of like cool videos out there, right, to sort of raising consciousness and things like that. So maybe that
Yeah.
can be done, but the in-person protesting is kind of like dangerous, right, to carry out. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's
Yeah. I guess unfortunately the protesting also happens on the other side of it. I saw something today about how in Michigan there's this giant car rally that's like blocking ambulances, and they have signs that say like "My body, my choice, COVID-19."
oh wow.
And then you're seeing
God.
Confederate flags, which is especially,
Oh,
it's Michigan, not like a South state.
right,
And then Trump banners. So
right.
you've got
Yeah,
demonstrations of unpleasant things as well.
right. On the left and the right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Huh.
YouTube
Yeah.
got brought. I love the I almost said the popular phrase is bread tube, which